is there any safe amount of alcohol to consume at all?
Yeah, no, there's no amount of alcohol that's good for you. So even this idea that they sold people on that a glass of wine per day is good for your heart, that's just not true. Alcohol itself is toxic to every system in your body.
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast. I'm your host, Ray Donovan, as always. Really looking forward to this episode. We're going to get into it pretty quickly, but we're doing a little bit of a different format here. Usually we'll have guests come on and we're highlighting underrepresented journeys of sobriety and recovery, from Black and Brown communities. Today, we actually have a practitioner joining us. We actually not only do we have a practitioner, we have a board certified neurologist joining us. And we're going to be talking a lot about how alcohol and the abuse of the substance actually affects our brains. So I know that we talk a lot on this show about how it affects us emotionally, how it affects the rest of our body, how it affects us culturally. But we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the thing that makes us tick outside of our heart. And we're going to talk a lot about the brain today. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Philippe Douyon.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like I said before we got on here, I feel like this is equally an important conversation for our audience, and also selfishly for myself. I know that you got an opportunity to catch up on my story a little bit coming into this, and knowing that I had been drinking for almost 3 decades, and I'm still alive to tell the story. I'm uh, have a little bit of hesitation to get into this because I'm worried that my brain maybe has shrunk to the size of a raisin at this point, but hopefully not. And we'll get into a lot of that. But before we do, why don't you give us a little bit of your backstory? How did you get into the space of neurology and the brain? You're obviously a brother, a man of color. We don't see very many of you in the space, I'm sure. So tell us a little bit about your journey, and then we'll get into the specifics on the episode.
Yeah, so for me, it was really when I had two family members who had neurological issues. So the first was my grandmother. And if you ever watch TV shows and movies like Soul Food, we were the family that got together Saturday nights at my grandmother's house. And we would just have these wonderful dinners. And those dinners were really part of my childhood and my childhood memory. But then she started developing signs and symptoms of dementia, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And all of those dinners stopped. And I watched
Mhm.
her really become a shell of the person that she used to be. And then I had a cousin of mine who developed epilepsy as a child, and she eventually grew out of it. But watching those two devastating neurological illnesses gave me a appreciation for how powerful and how amazing the brain is when everything functions the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah.
And that's what started me on this journey in neurology.
Wow. How young were you when your grandmother was diagnosed? And in my experience of dementia, it could be either really, really quick, or it can be, kind of a slowly debilitating disease, whether it's, Alzheimer's or, any other type of dementia.
Yeah.
How old were you, and how quickly did that process last for you? Because it sounds like it was extremely impactful, at probably a very, pivotal age for you.
Yeah, so she was diagnosed around 12, 13. I was like 12, 13 years old. And I
Yeah.
just watched her decline for more than a decade.
Wow.
Um, and so that was truly impactful, right? I mean, to
Mm.
see one of the people that you're closest to in the world, now they don't remember who they are. They don't remember who you are. They can't function independently. I remember when times where she walked out of her home and she was lost and we couldn't find her. And so that was really devastating, not only on her, but obviously on the family as well. But it was a quick diagnosis, quick symptoms, but then a really, really slow decline.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that. I've also, I mean, I think most people have probably experienced a loved one who has come into some sort of dementia at some point in their life. I am curious, and I don't know the studies behind this, but is there any discrimination when it comes to to dementia culturally and racially speaking? Like, are Black folks more susceptible to dementia just based off of our kind of generational ancestry, so to speak, and our genetic makeup than other cultures? Because I, in my own personal experience, have had multiple folks in my family, experience dementia, pass from it in their later years in life. Fortunately for them, but I've always been curious of that. Is there any hard and fast on the specifics around that?
Yeah, and to your point, there's a lot of different things that cause dementia,
Hmm.
right? So it's not just Alzheimer's. So things like high blood pressure and diabetes cause dementia. And in
Right.
fact, there's such a close association between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease that a lot of neuroscientists will tell you Alzheimer's disease is really type 3 diabetes. And so when you're looking at a population like Black and brown folks who have really high rates of high blood pressure and diabetes, then yeah, they tend to have higher rates of dementia. Um, Either that's due to Alzheimer's or maybe due to something like vascular dementia, which is we see in people with high blood pressure and diabetes and high cholesterol. Then you sort of factor in the impact that stress and trauma has on the brain.
Yeah.
Long term stress and trauma actually causes dysfunction in neurons, especially in the parts of the brain responsible for making memories. And so, people who are undergoing chronic stress, chronic trauma, they're going to have signs and symptoms of dementia that may or may not go unrecognized.
Yeah.
People who are depressed can present like dementia, and we have a name for that. It's called pseudodementia. And in Black and brown communities, people don't like to seek mental health, right?
Mm.
And so we do see higher rates of dementia. We do see Black and brown folks presenting later with signs and symptoms of dementia where it becomes really difficult to treat.
Yeah, I mean, the further out of the bag, I suppose, the cat is, the harder it is to reel it back in. I also think about just intergenerational traumas, and again, this is my experience. The folks who have succumbed to dementia late in their life, they weren't drinkers or substance abusers or anything like that over the course of their lives, but ultimately they couldn't escape this thing. So I've thought about, and we talk a lot on this show about generational trauma, and it shows up in other cultures as well, right? Like the Jewish community and
Yeah.
and what have you. And I've always been curious about how does that then metastasize in current contemporary generations that are living here today. And to your point, it either goes undiagnosed, we don't see it until later on, we don't really understand the source of a lot of these maladies. But it is something to really think about in terms of us being folks of color and how it might show up differently in our community.
Yeah, and I think we really need to start having different conversations in our communities. We really need to have different conversations about the stories that we tell, whether they're stories that hold people back or are they going to be stories that empower people. We've
Yeah.
got to have different conversations about the lifestyles that we live, right? So we've got to be physically active. Everybody always is worried about family history and what gets passed down through genes, but
Hmm.
genes is only part of the story. The reality is that thoughts about your health, what you're capable of, the way that you should be treating your body, what you should be eating and drinking, that's what gets communicated down, right? And
Yeah.
that's what then turns on and off certain genes that lead to illnesses. And so we have to start having different conversations and passing down different messages of what we are truly capable of.
Yeah. Greatness in our DNA is what they say, right? On the one hand, on the other hand, I mean, we have the authorship to really, write our own stories, right? To a degree, and I know
Yep.
that's a lot of the work that you do at your Inlay Brain Fit Institute, right? Is you're
Yep.
you're you're showing folks how to take charge of their brains and change their lives. Can we talk a little bit about your institute? How does one kind of enter into that space? And what does day one look like for an individual who's trying to take charge of their brain, like this seemingly imaginary thing that we can't actually wrap our hands around?
Yep.
What does that look like in terms of the work that you do through your institute?
Well, here's the amazing thing about the brain, right? We can actually see it on scans. We
Hmm.
actually can touch it, but you don't want people touching your brain, right?
No, probably
But
not a good idea.
yeah, but more importantly, you can change your brain. We used to think that our brains were fairly static, that the only times our brains really changed was when we developed some kind of dementia or if we had some kind of traumatic brain injury. But we now know that our brains are capable of making new neurons and new connections our entire lives, and that we're the ones in control of how our brains evolve. And if
Hmm.
our brains are capable of making new neurons and new connections our entire lives, that means that our brains are capable of adapting, they're capable of learning, they're capable of healing, they're capable of evolving. And what that means for the individual is that we are meant to evolve as individuals. We're meant to evolve into the best possible versions of ourselves. And so, in working with me, I teach people how to become the leaders that their brains need them to be in order for them to create success in their health, in their businesses, as well as in their lives. And day one, we're going to get you to think about what your purpose is. We're going to help you establish a new vision for your life and establish goals that will allow you to create that purpose and create that vision. The reality is that everybody has a reason for being here, and we all need a reason to get up in the morning. I've seen people who lose their purpose and they come to see me because now they're having signs and symptoms of dementia, but
Hmm.
there's no structural change going on in their brain. It's really because they've lost their purpose. They have no
Hmm.
they no longer have a reason to get up in the morning. And so they're depressed. And so having a purpose is really, really important. And then we get into all the things that you can do every single day that has a positive or negative impact on your brain. So exercise has a positive impact. The way that food impacts your brain, the importance of sleep, how constantly learning is really important, how surrounding yourself with the right people is also really important in terms of how your brain and your life is going to evolve. And then we also focus on just the importance of evolving physically, getting your body right, mentally, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. So it
Yep.
starts off with your purpose, your vision, your mission in life, and we get you to evolve into the person that you want to be. And we do it without prescribing a single pill.
I mean, I think that that's fantastic, and I think that being able to do that without prescription of some sort of medication is interesting, especially for the community that listens to this podcast, where for many of us, we had been self medicating for some reason or the other, and for some of us for longer periods of times than others. So to make that shift is a huge paradigm, and I'm going to make the assumption that you probably see all walks of life, come through your practice. Those who who are not coming from a space of substance abuse and addiction, and those who are. I'm curious, in your experience with folks who are coming from a place of addiction, whether they are, in the earlier stages of overcoming it and on their path of recovery and evolution, they're clearly coming into this at a deficit, right?
Yep.
Both neurologically and then also from the standpoint of their outlook potentially on life. You talk about purpose, and oftentimes folks who have spent years drinking, we're just trying to figure out why we did it in the first place,
Yep.
not let alone trying to understand what our purpose is. So what's your experience in working with folks who are coming from that degree of deficit? And we can get into the brain from there, but I want to talk more about the person, because the brain is but one component of a larger picture that you work on. And I'm curious what your experience is in working with folks of that ilk.
Yeah, so sometimes you can get people that have sort of been brainwashed into this idea that you should be drinking constantly, right? To celebrate, you should be drinking. When you're sad, you should be drinking. When you're partying with friends or going to happy hour, you should be drinking. And it sort of changes their brain and leads to addiction. But oftentimes, you get people that have experienced some kind of trauma in their life and they haven't worked through that trauma yet. And the way
Hmm.
that they have coped with that trauma is through the use of substances. And alcohol is an easy one because it is everywhere. It is
Yep.
marketed everywhere. You're told everywhere that you should be drinking. You even have the health industry that tells you it could even be healthy if you drink, right?
Yep.
Um, but here's the amazing thing about your brain and body. If you don't work through the trauma that you've had as a child, as a young adult, or even into adulthood, it has a way of manifesting itself later on in life. Whether you'll end up seeing me as a neurologist anyway,
Hmm.
whether it's because you now have an addiction and that's changed your brain and you're having neurological symptoms, or because in suppressing that trauma, your body now starts to manifest it in different ways. Sometimes
Yeah.
your body can manifest it in seizure like episodes. I saw one guy who, and this is kind of a bit of a funny story. He
We'll
had
take it.
pissed off the mob here in New
The
York.
mob. Okay.
Pissed off the mob here in New York. And so they
Yeah.
wanted to kill him, right? He was so terrified, he went into a pseudo coma for 3 months.
Really, just checked out.
Just checked out. He was in the
Jeez.
hospital. This is when I was at Bellevue. He was in the hospital, in a coma. There was nothing wrong. His brain was fine. All his labs, everything was fine. It was
Hmm.
just that he was under such psychological stress that this was how his body manifested
Wow. He just basically checked himself into his own anonymity program.
it.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Is that? I mean, is that something that is that? I guess that is science based. But I mean, when
Yeah.
you see something like that come through your door, you're like, okay, this makes total sense. Or you're just like, this guy's on the extreme of how the body can kind of manifest and take over.
I mean, we see stuff like this every day,
Mm,
where the body manifests the psychological trauma somebody has experienced because they haven't worked through it. And
yeah.
that's certainly one of the more extreme you know, kind of funny cases. I mean, not funny to that guy, but he did piss off the mob.
Yeah.
Um, but we see this happen every single day, right? I
Yeah.
just saw somebody a couple days ago had an argument with his mom and his whole body started shaking, right?
Yeah.
So we see it every day.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's been part of my experience too. I mean, I'm not having seizures, and I'm not falling into comas, but in my sobriety over the last 3 years, where I've kind of had to look closer in at my experience in life, I've definitely now tied into what's happening in my mind relative to how things are starting to manifest in my body, and it's absolutely true. It's not. I've experienced it firsthand, and I've tried to get like a better handle on it as well, right? Because I spent almost 30 years kind of trying to tamper that whole aspect of myself out, right? Like not tapping into the emotions intentionally, but not knowing by doing that I was also numbing my mind, and I was actively and voluntarily numbing these things that were happening in my body. And I think for folks that drink, that call becomes so strong that by the time, similar to even dementia, by the time you recognize it, you may be a little bit too far gone,
Sure.
down your path. But I want to get back to the alcoholic and the addiction addict's brain. I know that you talk a lot about neuroplasticity. I know you talk a lot about brain shrinkage.
Yep.
Can you, for the folks who are unfamiliar with those terms, those concepts, and how they relate to folks who are in active recovery, and then ultimately, folks who have been in addiction, how does that affect everyone in this space?
Sure. So neuroplasticity refers to your brain's ability to make new neurons and new connections. It refers to your brain's ability to adapt, to learn, and to heal after some kind of injury. And what we see when people have been drinking, even after a night of drinking, is that your brain will shrink. The alcohol dehydrates you, and it dehydrates the cells in your brain, and as a result, your brain shrinks when you get tipsy and when you get drunk. Now, if you're somebody who just did a night of drinking one time, and then the next day you're resting, you're hydrating, you're giving your brain everything that it needs, it will plump back up. But if you're somebody who is constantly drinking, what happens is that your brain starts to shrink on a bit more of a permanent basis if that's all you're going to be doing.
Mm,
And so we call that cerebral atrophy. Now, your brain is capable of a tremendous amount of healing. Your brain can heal days, months, even years after injury, as long as you're taking away the thing that hurt your brain to begin with, and you start doing the things that your brain truly needs in order to heal. And
mhm.
so, when we talk about people that experience addiction, their brains are capable of healing. Depending on the level of addiction, maybe it doesn't go back to a 100%
Ver-
healthy brain,
yeah,
right?
right.
But it can continue to heal and get better. But that lies within the person's own ability. That's within our control.
Mm. When I first came across your work and that really stood out to me, I was like, gosh, I started drinking when I was 13, 14 years old. And even though at periods of my life it was social, anytime you do anything for, for that period of time, obviously there's no moderation there, right? And it became an issue for me. I was like, man, I hope that my brain hasn't shrunk to a point where I can't reconcile and bring it back to, a proper, like, functional space. What are some of the things, if I'm not already doing them,
Yep.
should I be looking at? I mean, I'm now 3 years in here, in my sobriety, but what are some of the things that I should be looking at to help plump my brain back up, so to speak, like get it to a place where, I can feel proud about the journey that I've been on. I am curious for folks who are in my position, what they look at on their healing journey.
So exercise is probably the biggest promoter of neuroplasticity.
Okay,
Exercises causes the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
like
Uh,
any type of exercise, like strength training,
Strength
aerobic.
training, aerobic, something that combines the two is ideal. But if you're somebody who just loves dancing, find a way to dance 3 or 4 times a week. You don't necessarily need to be in a gym pushing heavy weight, although
Hmm.
there's significant neurological benefits to pushing weight. Right? As you put on muscle, it releases myokines, chemicals that are powerful antidepressants, anti-anxiety, promote neuroplasticity. So there are certainly real neurological benefits to pushing weight, but at least get your body moving, right? I tell this story often of, if you're somebody who's ever been scuba diving, you might come across a sea squirt. And a sea squirt is this like invertebrate animal that you're going to see attached to a rock or attached to some piece of coral. When a sea squirt is first born, it is a tadpole. It's got a brain, a nervous system. It's just like swimming around. And for the first 12 to 72 hours of its life, its sole purpose is to find a place that it needs to just park itself and never have to move again. Right? It's going
Okay.
to feed from that place, it's going to reproduce from that place. But the most incredible thing happens when it parks itself. Its body releases these chemicals that start to cause the brain and the spinal cord to disintegrate. And over time, all that's left is this little rudimentary cell where its brain was supposed to be. We see the same thing happen with people. When we live sedentary lifestyles, our brains
Hmm.
shrink. Like, we need to be moving, we need to be physically active. And so, if you're somebody in your healing journey, you've got to have an exercise program that you follow. I tell this to doctors, I tell this to patients. Every therapeutic regimen you come up with, I don't care if the person you're putting the person on medication for whatever, there needs to be an exercise program that goes along with that. You've got to get that person stronger, right?
Hmm.
The other thing I would say is, you got to be mindful of what you're actually feeding your body.
Hmm.
The foods that we eat have a tremendous impact on our physical health, our mental health, and our neurological health. And so, if we're eating to that point where we are bloated, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's inflammation. That inflammation doesn't just stay in the gut. That inflammation also travels to your brain, right? And that can cause a lot of different types of neurological symptoms. The way that we eat today is not the way that our bodies were designed to consume food. Today, you don't put any work into eating, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can have anything delivered, you can have anything door dashed, you can have your groceries. You put no work, no effort. You don't have to chase, pray, nothing. We have sugar readily available all the time in incredibly high quantities that is horrendous for your brain. Your brain on sugar is essentially dementia. It's essentially Alzheimer's disease,
Hmm.
right? So we've
Jeez.
got to be very mindful about the foods that we're taking in. We have to constantly be learning. I've got two sons, 13 and 11. My 13-year-old just graduated from middle school. And one of the things I've always told my kids is that commencement in French, right, is commence.
Come on.
It's the
Yeah.
beginning. Your real learning starts the day that you finish with school, the day that you graduate. Right? Learning is a lifelong process, and learning is a powerful promoter of neuroplasticity as well.
Hmm.
You've got to take time to relax. You've got to take time to distance yourself from all the noise and chaos that society offers. You got to do that through meditation or prayer. We know that people who meditate or pray 15 to 20 minutes a day, their brains look different than people who don't. Their brains look healthier. There are areas of the brain that are plumper, juicier, that have more neurons in it. And so there are things every single day on any healing journey that you should be doing to help your brain be as healthy as possible.
Well, thank you for that, because that makes me feel a lot better about the activities that I do in my own life. And I knew that they made me feel great, and a lot of these activities that I do, meditation, physical fitness, trying to pay attention to my diet, I know that it makes me feel fantastic, but I didn't know that there was a direct correlation to it being able to heal, my one of my very important organs,
Yeah.
in the brain. So I appreciate
And
that.
and sleep is another one. We've got to get 6 to 8 hours of sleep every single night. So
Yeah.
that's a big one too.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stacknday's.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. I feel like you talked about one of the greatest components to building, back your brain and neuroplasticity is doing new things, right? The exercise of recovery and sobriety is all about new things, and
Yep.
sometimes I wonder, and it is really really difficult, and I feel as though there's this tension that's pulling you back into like your innate kind of behaviors and habits. But I'm almost curious, now that we're speaking, how much of the recovery process in fact is just about healing the brain, right? Because I feel like at its core, like, I mean, the heart has a very specific function, the
Yep.
brain has a whole different function.
Yep.
And whether it be dealing with trauma, whether it be dealing with the degradation of the organ, recovery is all about paying attention to this thing that we just weren't thinking about in our early years of being addicted to substances.
Yep.
And the more that we can pay attention to that and be mindful and do things along those lines, I think the better shot we have at being able to live a fulfilled life, which sounds exactly about what you are working on in your practice.
Yeah, I think recovery is not just about healing the brain, it's about rewiring the brain, right?
Mm,
Your brain is very much its primary function is to keep you safe.
yeah.
And the only way the brain knows how to do that is based on past experiences. So
Mm,
even if you were doing something that is not healthy for you, your brain could at least predict the outcome of that. It can't predict the outcome of something new.
right.
But the problem with that is human beings tend to be creatures of habit. But being a creature of habit is killing our neurological potential.
Mm,
We need to have new experiences. We need to listen to new people who don't think like us. We don't need to adopt their philosophies, but at least hearing their perspective allows our brains to make new neurons and new connections. We need to travel to different places to see how other people live. The United States does not have a monopoly on healthy living, right? So
sure.
we've got to see how other
Very
people
far
do it,
from it, right?
right? And so we have to have these new experiences, learning new language, learning new skills, learning new instruments. All of that goes a long way to rewiring your brain so that way you can achieve the health and the success that you truly desire.
Mm. So what's your perspective? I mean, we live in a culture that is so polarized, where people are kind of resort to their tribes, so to speak, and we're all kind of listening to the same messaging. We're not critically invested at looking at anything specifically in our lives.
Yep.
I mean, this sounds like a huge like an epidemic, really. And alcohol use is just an offshoot of this underlying like cultural this underlying cultural issue that we have. Like, what is your perspective from when you take a look at it from a macro, and you look at our country, especially now as we're heading into the elections, and you have people who are just staunch this and staunch that? I mean, what's your thoughts on the current state of the American brain, so to speak?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're spot on. People are really about to dig into their tribes. especially after tonight, I'm sure, with this presidential debate, but certainly
Yeah, it'll
this
be
election season, right? And I think that the reality is that what is beautiful about the United States is its diversity, but we
Mhm.
don't tap into that beauty. And it's not just diversity in terms of people's backgrounds, it's diversity in thoughts, it's diversity in skills. And if we were able to tap into that, we'd see a country where we have more than enough resources for everybody. We'd see a country where we can all truly be thriving. We'd see a country where our stress levels would go down, our
Yeah.
health would improve, that there would be a lot of just love and giving and just friendship and unity in the country, right? At the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing. They want to have opportunities. They want to be healthy. They want their children to have more opportunities than they had. They want their children to be able to live really successful lives, whatever that means for them. Everybody wants the same thing. Yes,
Yeah.
we have different ideas of how you go about doing that, but to come together is much more impactful than to be driven apart. Every brain disease that we see, every single one, whether it's dementia, stroke, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, occurs because of a breakdown in communication and connection between neurons.
Mm.
Neurons are specifically designed to communicate and connect with each other. That's what makes them so special. And every disorder, neurological disorder, happens because of a breakdown in communication and connection. Well, when we see breakdowns in communication and connection amongst couples, husbands and wives, that leads to divorce.
Yep.
When we see it amongst family members, that leads to families just not being connected with each other, right? And you've got a lot of family strife. When we see a breakdown in communication and connection between countries, that leads to war. I tell people all the time that we need to start acting more and more like neurons. We need to connect and communicate. That's where our true power lies here in this country.
Mm. I love that. Connection is a powerful concept. We hear it in so many different spaces, even in the recovery space. We talk about the there's this adage, the opposite of addiction is connection, right?
Yeah,
And I feel as though that, to what we were speaking earlier, that's where we're more prone to creating those kind of healing linkages, those healthy linkages. And it's micro, and it stems all the way up into the macro. I feel like we can just walk around and see it all around us all the time. So I appreciate how you've kind of broken that down for us, and your perspective on kind of where we are in the country. um, I think it couldn't be more accurate and more timely.
yeah,
When we talk about the country and we talk about alcohol specifically, a question that comes to mind, and it's kind of come up a lot more lately in the last couple of years, is the whole concept around what level of alcohol is safe for consumption, right? I feel like most folks consume alcohol to some degree. I don't know if you
yeah,
do at all. I know that you've had some health issues in the past, and
right.
maybe by way of those issues, you stay away from it. But what's your perspective as a medical practitioner? Is there any safe amount of alcohol to consume at all?
Yeah, no, there's no amount of alcohol that's good for you. So even this idea that they sold people on that a glass of wine per day is good for your heart, that's just not true. The reason that they would say that is because in wine there's a chemical called resveratrol, which is a powerful
Hmm.
antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. But that chemical is not necessarily in wine. That chemical is in grapes. It's in other fruits and vegetables.
Right.
Alcohol itself is toxic to every system in your body. And they sold it on this idea that it could be good for heart health. Well, alcohol causes cardiomyopathy, where your heart muscle gets so big that it can't even contract. It can't even push blood flow out. It causes arrhythmias in the heart, which can lead to your heart completely stopping and going into cardiac arrest. It could lead to you potentially having strokes. So there's no amount of alcohol that is good for anybody. And in fact, alcohol is associated with 7 different types of cancers. Right? We've heard a lot lately about the rise in colon cancer. Well, alcohol is a big
Hmm.
trigger for colon cancer. During the pandemic, people were just drinking.
Yeah.
The only one of the only businesses that really skyrocketed was the alcohol business during the pandemic. Right? Now we might be starting to see some of the aftermath of that in terms of colon cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer. as well as over 200 other different diseases that alcohol is associated with.
Hmm. It's really unfortunate. I mean, there's this conspiracy that the system is set up in a way to keep people sick, as opposed to getting them healthy. As opposed to making sure that folks are in the best possible position to live a fulfilled and full life. And I feel like that window of time in the pandemic, where so many services were being shut down by way of the public good, liquor stores were not, and you had more folks who are already in a vulnerable position slipping deeper into that vulnerability with the substance, and then you had a lot of folks who maybe never ever had an issue with substances now just having more access to it and having to deal with loneliness and isolation and the unknown of the pandemic that caused them to also head down that space. I think you're right. I think we are at a point where we're going to start seeing a lot of the residual from those couple of years starting to trickle back into our society. Um, I don't think we're going to be able to avoid that.
Yeah, I think the disconnection that we experienced, right? I mean, we couldn't connect with our loved ones in the same way.
Yeah,
Um, some of us couldn't communicate with loved ones in the same way. That made us incredibly vulnerable, and a lot of people sought to deal with that vulnerability by using substances and especially alcohol.
yeah. Have you had any folks come into your practice post COVID, post like once they because I addressed my addiction
Yeah.
in the midst of COVID. It came to a head for me. I had to do something different. Have you experienced folks in your practice who are kind of starting their journey with you and trying to address their brain, on the just as a new challenge to them post COVID, and also carrying with them either still having an addiction or coming out of it? Is that something that you have direct experience with?
Yeah, I think, for people that had COVID, you had a certain amount of people that developed long-term COVID symptoms. Certainly, brain fog, anxiety, and depression go along with that. I'm somebody who believes that the more we learn about the brain, the more that neurology, psychiatry, psychology all come together. We just look at it
Hmm.
from different perspectives. And so, as a neurologist, I see people with anxiety and depression all the time. So when
Yeah,
you think about the changes that COVID caused when people got that virus, when you think about the social isolation, when you think about the things that people lost, I mean, people lost a lot of people, right? They lost family members and friends. They lost a certain level of independence.
yeah,
Um, they lost the uncertainty of what the future may hold. When all of a sudden the world can just shut down, that was traumatic for a lot of people.
yeah,
I was having this conversation not too long ago. Actually, I was having this conversation with my parents where I was saying, we're a couple of years out, but not all businesses have recovered.
no,
Individuals haven't recovered, right?
no,
People are still feeling the financial stress, the health related stress. Uh, you know, People haven't gotten back into their homes. You're seeing prices going up, right? Inflation's going up. This is going to be a time where a lot of people continue to struggle. And we
yeah.
need to somehow find a way to offer resources to help people because they're going to struggle in ways that have an impact on their mental health, their physical health, as well as their neurological health.
With that being said, can you talk a little bit about maybe a particularly challenging case that comes to mind for you, where you had a patient coming in with kind of the perfect storm of all of those symptoms, the anxieties, the traumas, the addiction, and they're just basically, for lack of a better term, and maybe just metaphorically, on your doorstep saying, doctor, can you help me? Can you walk me through one of those challenging cases that you've seen over the last little bit here?
Sure. So I'll tell you about somebody with a conversion disorder, which is essentially when somebody's dealing with a lot of psychological stress and it manifests itself in terms of uh, their bodies, right? But they don't
Mm,
necessarily have a neurological or medical illness. So one of the things that we did see with COVID, right, is that some people were stuck together. So some people who were married, right, now
yeah,
they weren't going to work, they weren't away from each other 8 to
yeah,
10 hours a day. They were stuck in the same space, right? And you might be able to tolerate somebody uh, when you're not seeing them throughout the day. But now that you're stuck with them, that creates different challenges that actually put a lot of people at risk of abuse.
Mm.
And so this particular woman was having these episodes that look like seizures. And when somebody has a seizure, they get a burst of electrical activity in their brain. And sometimes we can measure that by putting these stickers on the person's head called an EEG. It allows us to look at the electrical activity in somebody's brain. Well, put the EEG on her head, also looked at the symptoms she was having, and her EEG was completely normal. Her brain scans were normal. And looking at the way that her body was moving during these episodes, you could tell this was not somebody who had seizures or epilepsy. This is somebody who had a conversion disorder. This is how her body was manifesting stress. And in
Mm.
particular, the episodes sort of suggested that this was somebody who was being abused, which is something that we saw a lot. Now that people are trapped together in the same space all day, it lent itself to more cases of abuse,
Were we seeing this more in women?
more in women, right? And
More in women, yeah.
this was a woman who was being abused.
Yep.
So went and had a conversation with her about what I had seen on her EEG, what I had seen on the video of these episodes, and what I thought was going on. So we had that conversation, and she was scheduled for follow up. We sort of put certain resources around to help her and see her a couple of months later. And she looks great. Like this is now like she looks like a completely different woman.
Mm.
She just has a glow about her. And I'm like, hey, you look great. What have you been doing? Have you had any seizures? And she's like, no, I haven't had any more of these episodes. And I said, well, what have you been doing? She's like, I left my husband.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
And that for her significantly improved her mental and her neurological health. Right.
Mm.
She was brave enough to take the steps that she needed to take in order for things to get better. Not everybody has that level of courage. Not everybody has the resources to be able to leave. And oftentimes we see you can tell somebody what's going on, you can try to provide resources around them, but they stay in the abuse.
Yeah.
And as a result, they never get better.
Well, I feel as though you can make the analogy across many aspects of life and say if you can extract the negativity, whatever that is or whoever that is from your life, chances are there'll be a net benefit to your experience, both physiologically and I guess also neurologically.
Yeah.
And I think that that's fantastic and good for
Yeah.
her.
And look,
And
as a doctor, I'm not proud to say that I'm responsible for anybody's divorce, but in that case,
well,
it was
she
beneficial for her.
she got better,
Right.
right?
She got better.
She got better. We have this space of social media, right?
Yep.
And we're in this era now where it's all about personal development.
Yep.
It's all about getting better. There are many individuals who are known for their messaging around this, and there's many ideologies that speak to personal development and but you're coming at this from strictly from a scientific perspective. So how do you differentiate the science from the ideology? So when you got people looking to buy into the undeniable methods to pursue a better life, how do you make that differentiation for them so they're listening to the science and they're just coloring it with the ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have to differentiate it. I think you use the science to back up, to sort of affirm what it is that they want to be doing, assuming that it's positive,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that I really appreciate about your top business people is that your top business people know that they need to evolve in order for their businesses to evolve. A lot of the work that they do, a lot of the ideologies that they communicate, it's actually neuroscience, whether or not they realize it, right?
Hmm.
And maybe they don't have that degree, they don't have the terms that I have, but I just sort of come in as somebody who affirms those theories and back it with science. Because for some people, they need the science in order to say, okay, well, that this is going to work for me.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're somebody who, let's say you're somebody who follows like a Grant Cardone,
Hmm.
I don't know if you know who Grant Cardone is, but he's like this billionaire real estate investor out of Florida.
Yep.
Grant Cardone started off with addiction. He was addicted to drugs and alcohol, I think in his 20s and 30s before he turned his life around. The way that he was able to turn his life around was that he went and he learned everything he could learn about marketing and sales. Everything. He was selling cars, I think, at the time. And he learned, he would study before he would start off at the dealership. Every day he would study, then he'd go put into practice what he had learned. He did this every single morning. When you look at the trajectory of his business, right? He was certainly a multimillionaire. I think now he's got a real estate portfolio worth like 3 or 4 billion. When you look to see when his stuff really took off, it was when he learned everything possible about social media and how to communicate to people on social media.
Hmm.
That man, he tells the same story over and over and over again, right? But what he has done is really sort of just evolved through learning and through adapting, and now is incredibly successful. I mean, that's how all of us should go about our days. Our days should be: you wake up, you hydrate yourself with water, water and lemon. Um, then you move your body, you exercise. Then you learn whatever skills you need to learn in order to move your business forward, right? That is crucial in order for us to truly evolve as people. Now, he doesn't
Yeah.
communicate it in terms of neuroplasticity,
No.
but that's essentially what he's done. He's caused his brain to make new neurons and new connections, and he's rewired his brain away from addiction, or at least addicted to alcohol and drugs, to a
Sure.
potentially a new addiction of real estate and like whatever and making money. But it
Yeah.
is what it is.
No, I mean, and in that learning, he's been able to level himself up, and that leveling up has allowed him to be more successful, right?
Right. Yep.
I think that's an important call out.
Yeah.
A couple more questions as we kind of bring this in here. One is, I think, a clear question for someone who is sitting there listening to this podcast, and maybe they're still actively abusing their substances. Maybe they're in early recovery, and they're looking for a path forward. What would you suggest to those individuals who are looking for a way to apply this information that we're talking about right now to their real life experience in coming out of a very dark place?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, awareness that you're in a place that's not working for you is really important. Awareness that the alcohol, the drugs is not healthy. That's really important. I think that we all have the potential for great within us, but sometimes our environment is really the problem. And so there's like this story that if you plant a tree, right, you can give the tree sunlight, you can give the tree all the water, and for some reason that tree just is not growing. But if you take that tree out of the soil that it's in and move it to a completely different patch of soil, then you see that that tree truly blossoms.
Mm.
And the problem was never the tree. The problem was the soil that it was in to begin with. And you see the same thing happen with human beings. Sometimes our environment is toxic. It is what is holding us back from truly growing. And our environment can be the people around us. It can be certainly our physical space, the neighborhoods that we grew up in, the family that we feel like we can't keep at a distance or completely get rid of. Sometimes people dealing with addiction, you need a new environment. You need a new space to be. You need new soil to truly help you blossom. And that's part of moving away from the addiction, right? Like if you're somebody who is always drinking, well, you might have drinking buddies that are triggers for you. You you have to stop hanging out with those buddies. You might have a path that you walk home from work where it takes you right in front of a bar that you
Yep.
frequent. Well, you might have to take a different path home from work. You've got to move out of the environment that you're in. And you need to start adapting or start taking part in some healthier behaviors. And I would also say that you have to don't be so hard on yourself. right?
Mm.
Like we all have challenges that we face. We all have tests that we face. And the great thing is about tests is when you get through them, it gives you a testimony, right?
Mm.
So especially with you, look at the testimony that you have and all the people that you're now able to help because of the challenges that you faced and overcame. It's powerful.
It is powerful. I think that is a great message, and I think it's honestly the way to look at this whole thing. We have this adage again in recovery. People, places, and things. Sometimes those need to be completely flipped upside down and moved out of your purview in order for you to step into a brighter day. And again, I mean, the brain is something very specific, but it's connected, right? Quite literally to every aspect of your life, and vice versa. These things connect back into how you're supporting yourself from a physiological standpoint. So I love that. I guess the last question that I have is, what do you think people kind of just get wrong about this whole space? What is the largest misconception that people have when it comes to addiction and the brain that you've experienced in your work?
One, it's too complicated, and two, they can't do anything to change it. And they don't realize that they have absolute control to change their brains and to improve their health in every single way. And that includes to relieve themselves of any addictions that they may have. Your neurological potential is very much within your control. The way that your brain evolves is very much within your control. You make choices every single day that changes your brain, whether you realize it or not. Some
Yeah,
of them are good, some of them are not so good, right? I am so mindful of what I feed my brain that there's certain kinds of music I don't listen to, right? They may be very popular songs, but I don't want that messaging coming into my brain.
yeah,
I don't listen to the news because I don't want that negativity coming into my brain. There's certain things I don't look at on social media because I don't want that negativity coming into my brain. There's certain people I may not even talk to because every time you're around them, like it just they just drain you. It's just all negativity,
yeah,
right? The same way you have to be mindful of what you feed your body, you got to be mindful of what you feed your brain. And if you are, that helps you to take charge of your brain and become the leader that your brain needs you to be in order to overcome challenges and be successful.
yeah. Change your brain, change your life, right?
Absolutely.
I love it. Doctor, where can folks find you?
So they can find me on all social media platforms: Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook. They can go to my website, inlebrainfitinstitute.com. So INLE, brainfitinstitute.com. They can even just email me at philippedouyon@gmail.com.
Awesome. Dr. Douyon, really appreciate you spending some time with me here today, and giving us some insight into this, especially in our community. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll stay connected.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days, or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices and healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.